and Cornelius Vanderbilt left 95% of his fortune to his eldest son, leaving his other 10 children a pittance. The move was cold-hearted, even for him, but soon Vanderbilt's daughters came forward with a disturbing accusation. Although far from the rugged chaos of the American frontier happening throughout the 1800s, the East Coast business world was just as brutal as the Old West. One of the most prominent players in this game was Cornelius Vanderbilt, also known as the Commodore. His shrewd and ruthless business practices turned him into someone respected, feared, and sometimes hated, even by his own family. He may have been the one to put the Vanderbilt name on the map, but he wasn't its first member in America. Before his birth on May 27, 1794, his family had been in the country since the 1600s. Cornelius's ancestor, Jan Uertzen, first came to the U.S. as an indentured servant, and eventually took on the name Vanderbilt for the village of De Bilt, where he'd come from in the Netherlands. Commodore Vanderbilt's father, also named Cornelius, had his own ferry in New York Harbor, but had nowhere near the wealth his son would eventually gain. In fact, the family struggled to make ends meet, so an 11-year-old Cornelius Jr. had to leave school to work with his father. By the time he reached 16, Cornelius Jr. took what he'd learned from working with his father and decided to strike out on his own. Wanting to open his own ferry business, he borrowed $100 from his mother. Her investment proved to be a good one. Cornelius Jr. was able to launch his first official business in 1810. Purchasing a vessel, he ferried passengers and standard freight from Staten Island to Manhattan and back, making himself a modest profit. His reputation soon began to grow, and he earned a nickname to fit. Despite his young age and lack of experience compared to his fellow capitalists, young Cornelius Vanderbilt seemed born for the business world. Already he displayed so much ambition and authority in his dealings that he often seemed more like the leader of an army than the captain of a ferry. Therefore, the other captains endearingly called their young competitor the Commodore. In what was likely a union of status and expectation, Cornelius married Sophia Johnson, his first cousin, on December 19, 1813. Along with marriage, societal expectations at the time dictated that men needed to have many children to be successful. Thus, the Commodore and Sophia had 13 of them. As his family expanded, so did his business ventures. Then everyone on the Hudson knew all about the Commodore, and this notoriety granted him even greater opportunities. By 1817, Cornelius had built an impressive name for himself, so others naturally wanted some of his success. An extremely wealthy planter from Georgia, Thomas Gibbons, offered Cornelius a job captaining his newest steamboat between New York and New Jersey. The Commodore accepted, and with his still flourishing trade, he also started managing Gibbons' business. Cornelius carefully watched his employer's dealings and got first-hand experience with what it was like to run such a large company. Throughout his life, Cornelius was far from an attentive or responsible father, but he still dictated his family's movements. So around this time, he relocated his wife and children to New Brunswick, New Jersey. There, Sophia was more than capable of providing and caring for their children through running a prosperous inn. Cornelius worked for Thomas Gibbons, and later his son, until 1829, when he focused on building his own far-reaching empire. In establishing several new ferry lines, he met another steamboat rival in 1831 named Daniel Drew. After the two went head-to-head, Cornelius eventually had no choice but to buy Drew out. Drew's business tactics impressed the Commodore, and the pair entered into a secret partnership to avoid competing with each other. In growing his company, the Commodore had to contend with another monopoly in 1834, this time with the Hudson River Steamboat Association. To fight them, Cornelius adopted the People's Line as a name for his ferry line. This held similarities to the language used in support of President Andrew Jackson, thus garnering the same support for Cornelius's line. Aside from his use of political support, Cornelius pulled out all the stops in his fight against the Hudson River monopoly. After just a year of him offering unique luxuries on his ferries and undercutting prices, the Hudson River Steamboat Association forked over $100,000 and a yearly $5,000 just to get him to give up. Soon the Hudson River was too small for the Commodore, and he set his sights on Long Island Sound. Over the next 10 years, he continued using his now trademark ruthless and shrewd tactics to overtake anyone he went up against, becoming the dominating power in the area. But to this point, Vanderbilt's empire was still limited to the waves. He was about to change that. Growing beyond the ferry business, the Commodore tackled a burgeoning industry around Long Island Sound, the railroad. Through the 1840s, he targeted the best line in the area, the New York, Providence, and Boston Railroad. By cutting competing ferries, Cornelius caused the line's stock price to fall, allowing him to become company president by 1847. As his empire grew, Cornelius relocated his family again, this time to a home of his own construction. At 10 Washington Place in New York City, the Commodore built a house of considerable size, but still of only moderate luxury. This matched his reputation among New York's elites, who still looked down upon the Commodore and his lack of extravagance. Although Vanderbilt had become skilled in his business battles, the U.S. soon faced a much larger and bloodier fight. After the Confederacy's secession in 1861, the Commodore tried to do his part to support the American Union. Owning several steamships, he offered to help the Union Navy by donating his grandest, the Vanderbilt. In response, the government told Cornelius something he wasn't familiar with hearing. Believe it or not, many in positions of authority thought this secession business would be over in a matter of months. With this confidence, the Secretary of the Navy declined Cornelius's donation, as he believed the exotic Vanderbilt would be too costly to maintain and operate, thus making the ship not worth it. A year into the fighting, it was clear this wasn't going to end anytime soon, and the Union decided to take Vanderbilt up on his offer. To combat the CSS Virginia, a Confederate ship laying waste to one of the Union blockades, President Lincoln himself requested the aid of the Vanderbilt. Like his father, Cornelius's youngest son, George Washington Vanderbilt, wanted to do his part to protect the Union, joining the U.S. Service Academy in New York. While he did graduate, he sadly contracted a sudden and fatal sickness, succumbing before seeing any combat. The loss rocked the Vanderbilt family, even their steel-hearted patriarch, but as usual, the Commodore threw himself back into his business. In what came to be a famous stock market corner, Vanderbilt purchased the New York and Harlem Railroad in 1864, but it wasn't because he needed it. The Commodore would later state that he only bought it because everyone else said it was worthless, and he just wanted to prove them wrong. Next, Cornelius started making his trade more of a family business. Of all Vanderbilt's children, his eldest son William was far from the favorite child, owing partly to a nervous breakdown he had, and the fact that Cornelius believed him to be a simpleton. Still, the Commodore took a chance on William, appointing him vice president of the New York and Harlem Railroad shortly after purchasing it. Even though he was the oldest son, William's poor standing with his father initially caused him to be passed over as heir. This changed after he proved he could efficiently run the business, and the Commodore gave him control of the Staten Island Railway. William continued to impress and eventually became operational manager of all of Vanderbilt's railroads, securing himself as the family heir. The New York and Harlem Railroad connected to others in the larger area, so Cornelius had to deal with more opposition once he took control. This was nothing new for him, and he carried on with dominating any lines that stood against him, eventually taking control of several, including the New York Central Railroad and the Hudson River Railroad. Vanderbilt was becoming a titan, and he thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. Cornelius finally met his match in 1868, when he and his longtime secret ally, Daniel Drew, had a falling out. Out of spite, the Commodore tried to corner the stock of Erie Railway, which Drew had joined as treasurer. But he didn't realize that Drew and railway magnate Jay Gould had been intentionally releasing spurious shares to intentionally water down the company's stock. When the dust settled, Vanderbilt was out more than $7 million. It was an unprecedented defeat. Vanderbilt wasn't used to losing this badly, and although he previously showed admiration for those who matched his skill, this was different. The Commodore was only able to bounce back by threatening his opponents with a lawsuit. But Gould had cemented his place as Vanderbilt's arch-rival. Cornelius's contempt for Gould lived on, but to be fair, Gould wasn't satisfied with this one victory. While he would never take another win over the Commodore, he made it his goal to embarrass him as much as possible. In response, the regularly stern and collected Vanderbilt would often publicly lash out at Gould. Vanderbilt may have been a neglectful and unfair father and husband, but he seemingly still took it hard when his wife Sophia died in 1868. Traveling to Canada after his wife's death, Cornelius found another partner to join him in holy matrimony. Apparently he had a type, because Frank Armstrong Crawford was also his cousin, and 45 years younger than him to boot. The two married in London, Ontario on August 21, 1869, and he would spend the rest of his life with her. In the late 1870s, Cornelius's larger-than-life career ended with a miserable period caused by several chronic illnesses. For 8 months, he became quite the handful for his doctors, throwing angry fits and insulting them. Finally, the Commodore's long and grueling fight against his sickness ended, with him having spent his final months confined to his room. On January 4, 1877, he died while back at his home in New York at the age of 82. In the months leading up to his demise, Cornelius suffered from several illnesses connected to his heart and stomach, and likely syphilis, too. However, the final cause of his death ended up being exhaustion, simply from dealing with all his conditions. Vanderbilt's children may have been devastated, if only for a bit. Most were more likely bitter, considering they'd been left almost nothing from his massive $105 million fortune. In fact, Cornelius divided his inheritance largely between his eldest son William and William's sons. As for Vanderbilt's other children, his second eldest son Cornelius and his daughters Ethelinda and Mary weren't willing to accept their father's final decision. Aside from the Commodore's diminished mental faculties, his children argued that their older brother William had poisoned him against them. According to his siblings' accusations, William Vanderbilt had taken advantage of the Commodore's beliefs to gain the family inheritance. They claimed that William hired a medium named Mr. Stoddard as part of a devious ruse. In this alleged account, William hired Stoddard to perform a seance for the Commodore, one where the spirits would say exactly what William wanted. In this case, Stoddard reportedly took on the voice of Cornelius's late first wife, Sophia, who told the Commodore that all his children hated him, except for William, making him the most worthy of inheritance. To put the issue to rest, he settled on giving his brother and 2 sisters extra cash and trust funds that, while substantial, still paled in comparison to the total inheritance. While it may have been a shock for the Commodore's son Cornelius to receive such little inheritance, his daughters likely expected as much. The Commodore had always wanted more sons, and made his disappointment in his daughters clear with his neglect. His misogyny and disrespect didn't stop there, as he frequently cheated on his wife as well. But despite his flaws, his achievements would live beyond him. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to Keep Exploring with Us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factor Nate, for more incredible facts about everything. Thank you. End.